Good afternoon. Today we will talk about freedom and happiness. Today's talk is a little different from most talks, mostly because today's topic is different. Freedom and happiness is such a big topic to be put into a talk so small as this. Also, today's talk is approached very differently. I'm using bits of science and philosophy to understand and improve our understanding of freedom and happiness. Also, today's talk is without a conclusion. I ask you to come up with the conclusion for this talk. I'll ask you to use your life experiences to come up with the conclusion for today's talk. I'm not as qualified as other speakers, but I believe my idea deserves to be heard. I have put a lot of time into understanding freedom and happiness the way I think I will put it in front of you. From today's talk, you should expect a new way to look at one's degree of happiness and how it is related to freedom and how you can increase your freedom by reducing or by giving up on happiness. Why is happiness so important? Over the last few years, some millennia, we realized that happiness is a cornerstone of all our lives. There is no action or plan or goal that can ever be taught by any human that doesn't take into account happiness and what it means to that person. It is the struggle for many thinkers to come up with a definition of happiness. As I speak, there are so many definitions of happiness around everywhere. There is a psychologist's view on happiness. There is a field in psychology called positive psychology. And positive psychology is concerned with using practical psychological principles to improve the overall happiness of people. At the same time, there is an average person's view of happiness. What it means for an average person to be happy. Is it to be rich, or is it to have a big car or a better house? There is also a spiritual person's happiness, a spiritual person's view of happiness. For him, happiness is compassion, morality, doing the right thing. And at last, there is the neuroscientist's view of happiness. Over the last 50 years or so, neuroscientists have come up with ideas of happiness and how it is seen to them in the brain. There are chemicals such as endorphin, dopamine, and serotonin, and they cause certain chemical reaction in the brain, and this is responsible for our experience of happiness. The views on happiness are so different that any meaningful conversation on happiness can ever be made. We need a unified definition of happiness, a definition of happiness that allows a psychologist, an average person, a spiritual person, and a neuroscientist to be able to make them able to talk about happiness at the same time on the same platform. But before I get into my talk, I want to know, what is it that you think of happiness? How is it that how do you do about happiness? How do you attain it? How can you be more happy? I want you to think about it. Freedom. It is the front face of human struggle for so many millennia. There have been struggles for political freedom, for economic freedom, and spiritual freedom. It is necessary for me to wear down the elusive mask of freedom and to see what freedom really is. Philosophers, they have tried to understand freedom, but they have failed because their definition of freedom is so precise, is so narrow that it doesn't take into account the whole idea of freedom. I will approach freedom from a psychologist's point of view. Conditioning. It's a recent idea in psychology that has so much potential to help us understand the human condition. Let's do a thought experiment right now. We have a cage in front of us. There are 3 doors: door A, door B, and door C. And we leave a rat in this cage. Initially, the rat is free to go through any gate from one part of the cage to the other part. And as we do the experiments over and over again, we find that the rat will move between any of these doors with equal probability. 1/3 of the time from door A, 1/3 of the time from door B, and so on. But once we put a small bit of pleasure, a small bit of food behind any of these doors, and we continue with this experiment, we find that the rat has a more chance of going through one of these doors than the rest. If we put food behind door A and do this experiment over and over again, we will find that the rat will move at least 90 to 95% of the times from door A. What is happening here? The pleasure, the food, the pleasure is asking or compelling the rat to give up his freedom in choosing the door. Before there was pleasure, he could choose between these doors with equal probability, but now he is forced by his biology, by his psychology, and by his neuroscience to choose door A over other doors. Let me give you another example right now. Let's go on a grocery shopping. There are 3 stores in front of us. We have to buy bread, cheese, and potatoes. We go to grocery store A, and there we find, after picking up potatoes, bread, and cheese, we go to the clerk, and he bills it up for us. We pay, and before going out of the store, he gives us a free chocolate for choosing his service. This pleasure from getting this free chocolate will bind us to choosing his service in future. It will take away our freedom to choose between these stores in future. And so, the next time we go grocery shopping, we will choose store A over store B and C. Now this may not make much sense to you, but when you take the extreme case of loss of freedom in the case of addiction, when you look at drug addicts, you see that they have lost all freedom. They do not have any control over their habits. A drug addict is a slave of his habits. He has lost all his freedom to his habit, to his addiction. This is also interesting because something that gave him so much pleasure actually reduced his whole perception of freedom. He cannot exercise any more freedom as long as he is an addict. So now, summing up everything that I said about freedom, one's experience of freedom will rob one of his innate freedom. Once you experience happiness, you give up on freedom. Also, if you want more freedom, give up on happiness. Think of this on the whole scale. We have people fighting for political freedom. We have people fighting for spiritual freedom. What is the secret? The secret is giving up on happiness. I do not ask you to give up wholly on happiness. I don't ask you to give up wholly on freedom. There is a balance that you need to find between happiness and freedom. Happiness, the true nature of happiness. I will start this talk with 2 base ideas and 2 essential ideas. The base idea is happiness is hierarchical. Desmond Morris, if you guys know him, he's a famous psychologist, and he wrote a book, The Nature of Happiness. And in his book, he assumes that happiness can be categorized. If you read his book, you will find that he categorizes happiness as target happiness, cooperative happiness, competitive happiness. And his reasoning is that once you are done with the particular happiness, you move to this other form of happiness, and so onwards. But I don't think so. Happiness is naturally hierarchical without any of these innate categories. For example, an experience of eating sugar, is not as good as eating chocolate. It's also not as good as indulging in nicotine and tobacco. And again, it's not as good as indulging in cocaine. On the happiness scale, cocaine is a lot more it fulfills your body's desire for happiness. So there is a hierarchy in happiness. So instead of saying bodily pleasures and social pleasures, pleasures from body as in hedonism, and social pleasures as in altruism, they're not different, but they are on the same scale. Each person has its own hierarchy. For some people, social pleasures, they come on the top. For some people, hedonism comes on the top. But they are on the same scale. And only once when we believe that these two different kinds of happiness, they are on the same scale, can we understand happiness more deeply. So for example, there is a monk. For a monk, social pleasures are at the top. To be altruistic, to be compassionate, that's his priority. But at the same time, a criminal, he has hedonism, to be able to experience bodily pleasures. That's his priority. There's also a gradation of happiness. How do we grade happiness? Is it possible for us to estimate the happiness of an event just by looking at it in isolation to other activities? For example, can we just conclude that a person is happy or not happy just from the fact that he is gifted a Ferrari on his 17th birthday? Can we conclude that he is happy or not? Let's see. In the case of a rich boy, he was promised a state-of-the-art ship, but he was downgraded to Ferrari. The delivery was 5 days late, and the front bonnet was slightly dented. In the case of a poor boy makes friends with a rich boy, and on his birthday, he gets a Ferrari. The same action of getting a Ferrari, it has two different interpretations. So you cannot just conclude that a person is happy just from seeing what he gets or what he has. There are so many different nuances to happiness and to a person's personality that will determine his overall happiness. From this, I conclude that the experience of happiness is subjective and relative. If I have $10 million with me, getting $1,000 is not as much happiness as it is for another person. For a poor person, even finding $10,000 on the street is a lot of happiness. Maybe not for me. One cannot assume that the other person is necessarily happier because he has a bigger car or a better house, etc. We will talk about the essential case of happiness now. Internal versus external sources of happiness. External source of happiness. Firstly, I ask, what is the real source of happiness? Is it internal or is it external? External means materialism, hedonism. This approach to happiness was disregarded by philosophers some 2 millennia years ago. They found that happiness is in fact internal. As Shakespeare put it, there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Then maybe happiness is in fact internal. But what does it mean for happiness to be internal? There are in fact two different views on internal happiness. What is it? Let me put it in front of you. Psychological view of happiness. It's related to the mind. The idea that thinking the right thoughts at the right time is the secret to the greatest amount of happiness. This idea of happiness was the dominant view of happiness for the last 500, 600 years. Thinking the right thought at the right time, it led to the idea of morality. There is a right way to think. Maybe there is a right way not to think. Notion of morality. But also, there is a neurological view of happiness. It's related to the brain. When it comes to happiness, there are these neurotransmitters and neuroreceptors in the brain that lead to the experience of happiness. When anyone has a happiness experience, these neurotransmitters that release in the brain, and they're recepted by the neuroreceptors. The brain cannot differentiate between the different means of happiness on its own. When I have happiness from eating a chocolate, or when I have happiness from helping anyone, for the brain it's the same kind of activity. The chemicals do not have any history on themselves. To the brain, eating chocolate and helping someone is the same activity. And so, on a neurological level, all means to happiness have a similar, indistinguishable impact on the brain. And since happiness is subjective, and that all humans have near similar brains, you, me, and everyone on this earth, all humans have the same brain. It's in our genes. And by this I can conclude that happiness, the perception of happiness, is equal for all humans. Think about it on the whole scale. Humans fight for happiness. We want to be happier. I want to be happier than you. You want to be happier than me. But when we take this view into account, we find that every one of us has the same amount of happiness. There is no way you can be happier than me. There is no way I can be happier than you. The essential case number 2, the paradox of addiction. Every addiction starts with a large dose of happiness, which fades in quantity over time. When you look at anyone who got an addiction, for him, addiction was happiness, so much happiness in the beginning, but later on, it fades away. With time, the addiction reduces one's ability to perceive happiness. We should question how that happens. All our activities, in all our life, we look for activities that gives us happiness. And when we find one, we get into addiction and it reduces our overall perception of happiness. Neurologically, the experience of happiness is linked to the presence of these chemicals: endorphin, dopamine, serotonin, and catecholamine, and the sensitivity of the neurotransmitters. Once a happiness event is experienced, these chemicals are released in the brain, and then they are absorbed by the neuroreceptors. The efficiency of the neuroreceptor is in fact linked to the proportion of how often they are activated. If a person activates his neuroreceptors so often, the efficiency of these neuroreceptors to take in new chemicals, it reduces. And this is the reason why the addicts, when they take in so much drugs, they need to take in more and more drugs just to feel the same amount of happiness as before. The same case is when you eat chocolate. The first small bit of chocolate gives you so much pleasure. When you eat the second bar of chocolate, it gives you enough pleasure. The third bar doesn't taste that good. The fourth bar, you don't want to eat it. The pleasure from chocolate, it reduces as you eat it. The number of times you activate your neuroreceptors, their efficiency goes down. And as their efficiency goes down, your ability to perceive happiness also goes down. So in that case, if you try to chase down happiness, if you go behind the hedonism, the hedonistic lifestyle, you will end up being unhappy, because as you go behind happiness, you decrease the sensitivity of your neuroreceptors. You need more and more chocolates. You need more and more happiness experiences to just feel the same amount of happiness as before. At the same time, if you stray from happiness, if you give up on happiness, you find that you improve you improve the efficiency of the neurotransmitters. You improve the efficiency of the neuroreceptors, and then you find that it takes you less to be happy. You can just be happy by giving up on happiness. And therefore, the perception of happiness is finite. It is finite in the sense, at any particular moment, there is a particular level of happiness that I can perceive. If I achieve it, then I have to wait for some time so that my sensitivity will come down. It will increase, and so I can have more happiness. If I run behind happiness, if I run behind happiness, I will run out of happiness. If I stray from happiness, I build up happiness for myself. To sum up, the perception of happiness is finite. It is non-conditional, and it is equal for all humans. What do I mean by this? The perception of happiness is finite. There is no way you can go beyond a particular level. If you think that doing a particular activity will give you so much happiness as infinite, it's not true. It is finite. Once you do that activity, and once you have the happiness, the next time there wouldn't be so much happiness. Non-conditional. When it comes to happiness and when it comes to the brain does not differentiate between the means to happiness. The way you attain happiness, it's irrelevant to the brain. You're free to achieve happiness in any way you want. And it is equal for all humans. The idea that happiness is equal for all humans, it brings all humans together in this fight against the human condition. And by the human condition, I mean the idea that we all are humans. We have the same biology, the same psychology, the same neuroscience, and is what we have to fight against together. We don't have to fight against each other, we have to fight against our own human condition. And as I said, my talk is without a conclusion. This is where you're supposed to use your life experiences, to use your lessons you learned in life, and to find out whether happiness is really the way I said it is, whether freedom is really the way it is, and whether happiness and freedom are connected the way I say they are. It is up for you now to do it. This is the end of my first talk. I would ask you to ask me questions that you may have. Sure.
Yes, about the positive psychology, I've done a lot of reading.
Please wait. You can keep your microphone. We can't hear. Please keep your microphone.
Referring back to positive psychology, which is very popular these days. There's a guy called Martin Seligman. I'm not trying to sell his book, but he's the base sort of founder for a lot of this thought. But certain parts of the theory were okay, but I think it's not a terrible thing to be a bit negative and sad from time to time. And in order to be happy, in my opinion, you have to have periods where you are unhappy, so you can analyze those things that do make you happy and then you have to change the way that you approach happiness, and that is the only way to do it.
That is an interesting idea, because when you look at happiness, you only know what happiness means when you have been unhappy. Any person who has never been unhappy doesn't know what happiness means to him. When it comes to this idea of positive psychology, the definition of the psychological view of happiness is limited, because it's limited to just psychology. It doesn't take into account the philosophy of happiness, the neuroscience of happiness. When he talks about happiness, and when a positive psychologist talks about happiness, he talks of happiness in the small realm of psychology. But as he said, you need to be unhappy just to know what happiness is. You need to know what happiness is only by being unhappy.
I meant for short periods of time, not continuously unhappy.
The idea of happiness, as I put it, was that when you stray from happiness, when you give up on obvious kinds of happiness, watching a movie or going to a concert, these are obvious forms of happiness. When you go there, it's obvious for you to be happy. And when you go for these obvious forms of happiness, you reduce the sensitivity of your neuroreceptors. And when that happens, it reduces your overall ability to feel happy. But at the same time, when you stray away from obvious sources of happiness, you realize happiness in deeper, more meaningful ways than just these obvious sources of happiness.
I have a comment about freedom.
I'm sorry. Yes, freedom.
I was just going to say, I think the best way to experience freedom, and I've done this myself, is that everyone has a security blanket that they like to cling to. It could be your job, it could be your house, family unit, whatever. And in order to really experience freedom, you have to just throw that away and go somewhere else. And so I've done it myself many times. I urge people to let go of all the material goodies that give them comfort and security, which doesn't mean that you can jettison spiritual comfort like yoga or something like that. Definitely continue that, but just go to another place where nobody knows you, a totally new experience, and let yourself go with it for at least 3 or 4 weeks, and then you'll really understand what you are about and your freedom, what freedom is. I think everyone can do that.
That's interesting. As I put it, the experience of happiness, it reduces your freedom. Whenever you have a happiness experience, you become motivated to choose something over the other. As he puts it, when you have these security blankets, you're more likely to cling to it. You're more likely to be in your comfort zone and going out of it. The true nature of happiness is the ability to choose between different alternatives in equal probability. If there are 10 doors to a house, and if you can go and enter this house using 10 doors in equal probability, the first time you take door 1, the second time you take door 2, and so on, you're free in choosing the door you want. But at times, you choose door 1 more often than door 2. You choose door 1 the most often. You choose it more than any of the doors. This demonstrates a lack of freedom in choosing the doors. It happens in life that we are so motivated to do something more than the other. It reduces our overall freedom in life. It demonstrates a lack of freedom in our life. But all of this is caused just by our experience of happiness. I do not ask you to give up on happiness completely, but you have to find a balance between happiness and freedom. You cannot be it doesn't make much sense to be free but not happy. It doesn't make much sense to be happy but not free. You have to find the way the middle point, which is yours to be happy and free. When you feel you're happy and free, that is your point. That is the thing that you have to work for.
My case about like drink alcohol. Since 4 to 5 years ago, I did not drink at all. I did not drink at all. Before the time, I got together with my friends, some acquaintances. Went to a bar and had a drink under the pressure of going together. But at the moment, I felt that I don't like to drink. So gradually I get away from drinking. Nowadays, after quitting drinking, I feel very released and kind of confident of not drinking anymore. But to some people, it looks like it looks not natural, or it looks different. But I don't mind anymore. When I look at other my like friends or general Korean, as I used to do, they seem like drinking very much. I want your view. So how can you compare Korean drinking alcohol and the Indian people drinking alcohol, the culture?
Okay. Drinking is not really common in India. Because of the religious strictness in India, and in fact we have a state, Gujarat. It's almost impossible to sell it's almost impossible to sell alcohol in that state. There are around 60 million people who live in that state, and none of them drink. The trend is spreading from that state to other parts of the country. So I would say drinking is not really that common in India. But at the same time, India is such a boiling pot of religion. There's so many religions that continuously exist in India. We have Hinduism, we have Buddhism, we have Jainism, we have Islam, we have Christianity. And because of Islam, Hinduism, and Jainism, they have strict boundaries, they have strict rules against not drinking. So drinking is not really common in India. But as you put it, when you gave up on drinking, you did two things at the same time. You strayed away from obvious happiness. And so you increase the efficiency of your neurotransmitters, you increase the efficiency of your neuroreceptors, and by that you allow yourself to find happiness in a much more deeper and meaningful way in everyday life. And at the same time, you increase your overall happiness, you increase your overall freedom in life. By giving up on drinking, you said no to happiness, and you found a balance between happiness and freedom. You improved your freedom. You went to the freedom scale.
So that is a kind of my trigger thing. But apart from drinking, I come to enjoy singing. I joined the singing group, so I pretty much I participate very often and get delight from singing. Mm-hmm. And another thing I want to point is that Korea, the government allowed many casinos,
yes,
so betting places it was illegal, totally illegal dozens of years ago, but it is much easier to set up that industry several places in Korea. And also like horse races, bike races, and boat races. And I heard the consumption of alcohol, Korean people, is very high. So the ratio in worldwide, Korea is ranked in top. Korean people, they are very passionate. They are very concentrated in doing something at one time, and they easy to forget. So as time passes, and so those extreme happiness coming from doing those things, that is not healthy, generally speaking, to Korean people. I think. What is your opinion?
Happiness, which is so extreme, it leads to addiction. It leads to addiction to a particular form of life. As I have seen myself after coming to Korea, it's because people in Korea, they are so much behind happiness, they want happiness all the time, that they lose freedom. And it's my own case that after coming to Korea, I've got myself engaged in so many activities, and I've been able to find happiness in so many different ways, that I have lost freedom. That for the last few days, I couldn't find any time for myself, for my own thoughts. I lost freedom in terms of time. I did not have any more free time. But at the same time, I did not feel free as much as I used to feel free back in India. In the absence of happiness back in India, I could feel freedom, as in thinking, and I could do activities, take up activities the way I want them to. But after coming to Korea, there is a kind of constriction on what activities I can take and activities I cannot take.
My personal experience is that happiness comes from freedom, but freedom comes from if we are free from ignorance, and suffering comes from causation of if we find causation of suffering, we can get freedom. So sometimes I got anxious. At that time, I tried to find out the causation of some ignorance. So I live with for example, I live with my mother-in-law, and she is 92 years old. And if she takes some action, at that time I got angry or something. And suddenly I took over my causation of anger, and that I have some mistake, I find mistake, so I can stop the anger soon. So today you have explained about happiness, freedom, and many people have a different kind of some magnitude of desire. So by desire magnitude, he makes some happiness differently. So there is many subject to find out real happiness comes from freedom or.
It's true that happiness comes from freedom. When you're free, you can go behind happiness. But at the same time, when you go behind happiness, you give up on freedom. Most countries, when they fought for their freedom, the most important motivator was happiness. When they are free to make their own decisions, when they're free to make their own decisions, when they're free to do whatever they want, that was a motivation for happiness. But as most people realized, and as Mahatma Gandhi himself realized, that it's important to be free first in soul, and then be free in as a nation. It's important to first make the people free in their thoughts, to be able to say no to pleasure first, and then we become free as a country. It was linked to his freedom struggles. When Mahatma Gandhi, when he did his freedom struggles, we had these different movements. One of them was saying no to British goods and manufactured goods. What was the reason behind saying no to British goods? Was that we want freedom from their produced goods. We don't want to wear any of their goods. We don't want to be dependent on them anymore. And once we find our independence from them, then we can go and ask for political freedom, for economic freedom. First, we have to be free ourselves from our own desires. When we say no to British goods, we take away our desire for British goods. We become free from them spiritually, then politically, then economically. Yeah.
Last thing that comes to mind. I think what we've just heard from some other people here, if I'm going to try and make it concise, is that when you give up something, that you can substitute something else a lot more positive for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that change is good. So I think you always have to be ready for change. In my personal case, I grew up in Canada, and of course, when I was a student, I decided to stop eating meat. Well, in my country, that's weird, really, really weird. And so it was looked upon as really strange and stupid, and what's wrong with me? And so, but now it's been many years, and I realize it's the right way. I don't try and convince anyone else, but I know I feel a lot better, and just it's about giving up something that you think that you've outgrown: drinking, smoking, gambling, eating meat, whatever it might be. It's your case, and saying to it, okay, goodbye, that's not part of my life anymore, but I'm going to do this activity, which is going to bring more positive and make me more happy. That's what I think.
That's a really interesting idea. If you want more freedom in life, find something that gives you so much happiness and say no to it. When you say no to something that gives you so much happiness, you find more freedom in life. When you give up on meat, as in your case, it's so important to your lifestyle, but when you say no to it, you get more freedom in choosing your food. You get more freedom in making your food preferences, making your food choices.
Okay, when I was in India and I experienced and then I saw a lot of people's life, and then, like in Chennai, the southern area, there were a lot of poor people. Like when I just stopped by my friend's house and he was just a driver, and there were little kids, but in a really, really small room. But I saw their happiness, like they were really happy with themselves. But I felt, and then what's the level of freedom, their freedom? Because I just wanted to hear about their how they can pursue their freedom, like in their big happiness. So I'm a little bit curious, like of your opinion about what do you think about their life, like really poor people, but who have really big happiness. But I don't know, like what's the level of their freedom.
Okay. As I said before, Happiness is equal for all humans. It's the same for a rich kid and a person who is poor. There are different ways this happiness comes out. For a rich kid, the only way to be more happy is to have bigger cars or a better ship or etc. But for a poor kid, just having someone to understand them, just someone who can give them food, that's their form of happiness. That's all they need to be happy. And when it comes to happiness and freedom, they might not have freedom as in the case to go to a different country and engage in different activities. That's not the kind of freedom they have. But their freedom is in the case of associating with people freely. When it comes to rich people, they have such a narrow group of people they associate with. For them, they just need people around and they will associate with them. There is freedom as in terms of social engagements. They are free to engage with anyone. They can eat any food. They do not have any preference. If it's spicy, it doesn't matter because they don't get food. They don't get enough food. So they have to eat any food. That is their freedom. And it comes to maybe they have freedom in terms of the games they play. They don't have choices. So they play any game they get. This is their freedom. Maybe they have freedom in terms of the music they listen to. Because there isn't enough music around. They will find freedom. They will find enjoyment in any music they get to listen to.
Yeah, here. Please. Thank you.
I'm not sure if this question is about me, so forgive me if I speak out of turn. But in what ways do Jainism and Buddhism differ on their views on freedom?
Okay. Well, I'm giving a talk on Jainism just after this. So I think I can really answer that question after the presentation.
I read an article about Bhutan. Bhutan has kept Buddhist tradition very well, and Bhutan is generally very happy with their modes of living. Recently, still they are preserving their tradition very well, but Western culture approaching in fast way, in fast speed, and some of Bhutanese, they all have been exposed to the Western culture, and they so few of them have changed their lifestyles, and they start to feel deprived some way of, so they became materialistic, and their lifestyle also has changed. People to have cell phones and internet, and they feel lives not stable anymore. And so I want to check with you. So which one goes first, spiritual thing or material thing? And how Bhutan will move in future from your observation?
I said in my talk that there is a need to have a balance between freedom and happiness. When it comes to materialism, it is extreme happiness. What the belief of materialism is that let's have happiness in any form we can have. And for a materialistic person, if a certain activity gives them freedom, gives them happiness, they will pursue it. But in my talk, I also said that one of the ways to have freedom is to say no to happiness. And so when we talk of Bhutan, we have to find their balance between happiness and freedom. What is their balance? What is the balance that their society allows them to have between happiness and freedom? Maybe it's not okay for them to give up on cell phones because it's such a part of our society now. Maybe it is okay for them. It depends on how their society finds this balance between freedom and happiness.
And let's come to Jainism.
Okay. My second talk is about Jainism. Jainism is in fact a really tiny religion, even in India where it originated. There are about 5 million followers of Jainism. The religion was founded by Adinath, one of the main guru when it comes to Jainism. And the oldest record of Jainism is about 2,500 years ago. Mahavira was the most influential teacher of Jainism. The emphasis of Jainism is on non-violence. The most important element to Jainism is in fact non-violence. We believe that suffering, even when it comes to animals or plants, should be reduced. We believe that there is an equality between all life forms. No life form is better than the other. A cat, a mouse, a dog, an ant, or a human, all their life have the same meaning. The word jain comes from the Sanskrit word jain, and it means to conquer. The Jainism is in fact a religion about conquering and fighting against passion and bodily desires. Because the biggest of all battles take place not with others, not outside, but inside your own heart. Can you give up on pleasure? Can you give up on passion? This is what a Jain does. There are two different sectors of Jainism. There is Shwetambar and there is Digambar. The difference resides in the way they dress, the way they go out with their practices. Although the difference is not so big, it's not really common for these two people to worship together. They might have different mantras, they might have different beliefs, but on the whole, they share the same origin. The idea of non-violence in Jainism can be seen in the particular incident of Jains not walking during the night. When you see monks walking during the night, this is so rare because it is most likely to hurt any insect, any small animal during the night. And so Jain monks, they do not walk during the night. Jainism, it preaches a strict diet of vegetarianism. Jains do not eat meat, egg, fish, and even the strict Jains, they do not even eat potatoes or onions because they believe that to grow these vegetables and when you pluck them, you kill insects by plucking. Because potatoes and onions, they're root vegetables. You have to pluck them out of the ground. And when you pluck these vegetables out of the ground, there is a chance you can kill insects. So strict Jains, they do not eat potatoes and onions. Most Jains would cover their mouth while speaking. And because they believe that harsh words that can cause pain, these words are a kind of violence. So they try to protect others from their harsh words. I will not go into any of the philosophy about Jainism now because it's a really big philosophy, and although it's really similar to Buddhism, it has its differences. From my history class, I remember that 2,000 years ago, there was a serious conflict, serious religious conflict back in India. There was Hinduism, which is a very lay religion. They did not have lots of rules, lots of rights, what to do, what not to do. When it comes to Jainism, it's really strict. Monks have to do particular things. They have to dress in a particular way. In fact, some of the monks, they're not supposed to wear any dress at all, even during winter. They eat in a particular way, they sleep in a particular way, they have particular times when and when not to eat. And because of this conflict, Buddhism arose, and it was called the middle path. It's not as strict as Jainism, but at the same time, it is stricter than Hinduism. 2 weeks from now, I will be celebrating the biggest festival of Jains. It's called Prajushan. It starts on 21st August, and I request you all to fast for 1 day. And when you fast for just 1 day, you will realize the importance of food. For now, food is just something you eat. But once you fast for a day and you realize it's not possible to live without food. It's such an essential part of living that just giving up on food for a day will give you so much freedom of thought. You will find yourself much more inclined to think of different ideas, to think of things in a different way than before. I ask you to do it for a day, and you will realize what is the true path of Jainism. Yes, the difference between Buddhism and the Buddhism and the Jains' understanding of freedom is that when it comes to Jain, we have so many strict rules on happiness that we, on the scale of happiness and freedom, we move towards freedom. We are more inclined towards freedom compared to Buddhists. We give up on happiness so that we can be more free. But Buddhism is the middle path. We have freedom and happiness, both at the same time. It's more on the right side on the happiness-freedom scale.
Can you give an example?
Sure. When we talk about both Buddhist and Jain monks, they shave their head. But Buddhist monks, they shave their head, whereas Jain monks, they pull the hair one by one. This is the degree of freedom that Jains feel in their life. Because because Jain is a religion about fighting with your pleasure and bodily desires. You can only be a good warrior when you have gone through pain, when you have experienced pain, and at this extent, you become more stronger in saying no to pleasure and bodily desires. It's more like a practice for being a good warrior.
As I understand it, Jainism, there's no belief in creationism or destruction, so that means no God is, or let's say divine being is allowed to either create the universe or destroy the universe. How might that be different than Buddhism? Is that the same?
I think it's the same.
Question? More? Okay, if we have question about this talk, then you can raise questions